In 1799, the great French military leader Napoleon led his army into an obscure Egyptian town where they uncovered an ancient artifact. And initially, this artifact was misunderstood. Its significance was deemed small. Its value was just that it was an ancient artifact from Egypt. And it was kind of set to the side and viewed as something to be forgotten. And some 30 years later, a scholar was inspecting the artifact and noticed that the symbols actually aided them in deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics. This artifact turned out to be something that you know of as the Rosetta Stone. It was an object that was originally viewed as unimportant and insignificant, and yet it changed history and unlocked much of the secrets that Egypt held. In 1858, Joseph Ives was leading a group through a region called the Colorado River in America, seeking settlement. And when he arrived there, he noticed its features, and then he wrote this in his journal. He said, "The region is, of course, altogether valueless. It can be approached only from the south, and after entering it, there's nothing to do but leave. Ours has been the first and will doubtless be the last party to ever visit it. Today, that region experiences over 5 million visitors each year, and you know it as the Grand Canyon." In 1928, Alexander Fleming was a scientist, and he came into his lab one day and discovered that there was a certain kind of mold that had killed bacteria in one of his petri dishes. The observation at first was regarded as unimportant. Much of the scientific community dismissed it. But yet, just 10 to 15 years later, in the late 30s and early 40s, as World War II was rampant, the 3 men learned how to mass produce this mold and to purify it. And it became known as the miracle drug, saving thousands of lives from infection. You know the drug as penicillin. You see, oftentimes groundbreaking, life-altering, world-shattering events are dismissed and viewed as insignificant in the moment. It takes time and history to prove their significance and value. The same is true of our passage tonight. We'll look at Acts chapter 16 and specifically look at the verses that deal with the conversion of a woman named Lydia. Now, located in this chapter as a whole, Dr. Luke is writing to us, right? You know Luke. He's a doctor who pens the book of Acts as volume 2 of his gospel. And he's showed us in this narrative that Paul, the Apostle Paul, is on his second missionary journey. You might remember that Paul's first missionary journey included his partner Barnabas, but in the second journey, they have a dispute over John Mark, and so they split and go their own ways, and Paul takes Silas with him, and they take off to revisit these churches that he's planted. And along the way, while they're stopped in Lystra, they're encouraging the believers there. Paul is impressed by this young man named Timothy. And he says, "Hey, Timothy, come join us." And so the dual missionary team now becomes a trio as Timothy arrives. And what we learn in this passage tonight is that Luke also joins this group. As they were traveling, we read in the verses that precede our passage that the men desired to enter new cities, to head into Asia Minor, to share the gospel with people who had never heard of Jesus. And yet something crazy happens. God prevents them. And we can assume that this prevention was frustrating, it was confusing, perhaps even exasperating. I mean, these missionaries were here taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. Is this not what Jesus wanted? I thought God wanted all people to hear the gospel. This was true. But God's plan was so much better than Paul's plan. While Paul saw large cities in Asia Minor, God's plan entailed a trip to a Roman colony lying in Europe, a place called Philippi. And from there, the gospel would go forth in miraculous ways. You see, in verse 9 of chapter 16, Paul received a vision of a man in Macedonia, urging them to come and to help him. Verse 10 tells us that immediately this is where Luke joins in with the group and the trio becomes a quartet. This 4-person team sets out for Macedonia, for Philippi. Our passage tonight outlines this story of how the quartet, how this missionary team arrives in Philippi. Our narrative is void of any grand entrance of the gospel. There's no trumpet sound. There's no grand celebration. The newspaper didn't run a series on Paul and the missionary team have arrived. In a lot of ways, this event was unknown, insignificant, and had little value. But yet, history will prove that this conversion would lead to all of Europe hearing of the gospel. This first conversion in the Roman province would prove that Rome would fall and Christ would reign. This was the start of Christianity taking over the world. As we read this narrative tonight, I want to preach with this title in mind. I want you to understand this from Acts 16, verses 11 through 15, that as witnesses who have been empowered by the Holy Spirit, we have been empowered with confidence. That's what I want you to see in this passage tonight, that you've been empowered with confidence. Look at Acts chapter 16. Let me read these verses. Hear what Luke writes. He says in verse 11, "So setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace, and the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in this city some days, and on the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate to the riverside, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the women who had come together. One who heard us was a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. And after she was baptized, and her household as well, she urged us, saying, 'If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay.' And she prevailed upon us." Here's the teaching goal for the text tonight. Opening our eyes to see God's hand at work will create confidence to obey the Great Commission. This passage asks us to open our eyes to see God's hand at work. And when we do, we will be encouraged with confidence. You'll be empowered with confidence to then obey the Great Commission. I want to show you 3 ways that we see God's hand at work in this passage and in your own life. And from that, I want to show you that you can be filled with confidence and obey God. So first, notice this with me. See God's hand at work in the circumstances. God's hand is in the circumstances. We've already noted how God has orchestrated this team from Asia Minor into Macedonia. We've seen how God has worked in their travels. But look specifically at verse 11. Luke records that they set sail from Troas and they made a direct voyage to Samothrace. This travel, if you were to look at it on a map, was a direct travel northeast with one stop in between at a little island that Luke notes as Samothrace. Now, notice this in verse 11, Luke uses this specific phrase. This is important. He says, we made a direct voyage. It's not just to say that they went in one direction. It's actually a nautical phrase. It's a phrase used by sailors to say that the wind was at their backs. In fact, it only took them 2 days to make this trek. But when they come back to Troas in Acts chapter 20, it will take 5 days. Now here's my point. They were sailing with exceptional speed. God gave them favorable conditions. It was smooth sailing. God's hand was at work in the circumstances. But greater significance lies in the stop at the island of Samothrace. It's a mountainous island. It's known for its peak that rises 5,000 feet. But actually, this Aegean island is known for more than that because it's steeped in Greek and Roman mythology. In fact, one of the great statues of Greek mythology that stands in the Louvre today in Paris, France, comes from this island. It's the Greek goddess of victory known as Nike. as she stands in the Louvre, and this was found on this island where men would have traveled to the peaks and worshiped it. In addition to the worship of that goddess, there was also the worship of the gods called the Kabiri. The name probably means nothing to you, but they were associated with cult worship. They were believed to give fertility and to aid sailors in their travels. The worship was extremely immoral, but here's what I want you to see. People who traveled through this area and stopped at this island, they were known for rising to the top of the peak to worship these gods so that they would have smooth sailing. And notice what Luke says in the passage. He says nothing. You see, Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke had no need to climb to the mountaintop to worship this God. They knew the true God who had created heaven and earth. They knew that they didn't need to worship this God for smooth sailing. Their God would protect them. Not only that, they didn't need to worship these gods for fertility. They knew the author of life and the one who gave new birth. Despite their denial to go and worship these gods, God prevails and shows them that he would give them favorable sailing. There's his hand at work in the circumstances. What we find here in the cultural context of this verse is simply this: a breadcrumb of confidence. What I mean by that is that God was giving them a breadcrumb of confidence to trust him. You know what I mean by this? A breadcrumb, if you were to track a little kid and you put a little M&M and another one, and they would follow wherever you place them. You see, I'm convinced that God does this with us. He shows up in small ways and large ways. And he gives us enough confidence to keep trusting him. Because let's be honest, we're forgetful people. And this is exactly what he does in this passage. And Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke, they trust that Jesus and the Spirit would lead them and protect them. How much confidence do you think they had when they arrived in Philippi in just 2 days? I wonder, did the captain of the boat stop them and say, hey, what is the God that you serve? What's his name? We've never sailed this fast. We've never had favorable conditions like this. Who is your God? I wonder if Paul stopped, shared the gospel, and he believed in Jesus, and we'll hear of his story in heaven one day. My point is simply this: God's hand was all over this trip. It was evident he had called this team. It was evident that he would take care of them, that he would provide for them. He was giving them a breadcrumb of confidence. My question for you is, how often do you miss those breadcrumbs in your life? How often are you overlooking what God has done? You see, I'm convinced that too often we go through life and we miss all that God has for us. We're blinded from his work in our lives. We walk this life oblivious of the circumstances that God's orchestrating for our gain and his glory. I'm afraid we have adopted eyes that dismiss the miraculous. We miss the moments he's given us to grow our faith. And so my plea with you tonight is to open your eyes and see that God has placed breadcrumbs of confidence all throughout your life, that he will take care of you. He will be faithful, that you can trust him. And here's the kicker in all of this: your God doesn't have to do it. He doesn't have to, but because of his great love, he does it anyways. What love we have from the Father in heaven. Or perhaps rather than the challenge of trusting the Lord and opening our eyes, maybe we need the challenge to remember that we're to live a countercultural life. This missionary team, they had no need to go and worship the idols, but maybe we have fallen into this trap. We listen far too much to what culture says. We listen far too often to what the news or TikTok or Instagram says. Maybe perhaps for us, we need to be reminded that as Christians, we've been called to swim upstream, to go against the grain and to stand out. We need the reminder that God will control the circumstances around us for our own benefit, his glory, and that we can live counterculturally. We need to remember the words of Paul that he would write later in his life in Romans chapter 8, when he says, we know that for those who love God, all things, not some things, not a few things, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. We can trust him. And he leaves us breadcrumbs of confidence so that we would trust him even more. God's hand was at work in the circumstances. But now look at verses 12 and 13 with me and see this, that God's hand was at work in the confusing. Have you ever been walking in life and looked up to the Lord and said, this makes no sense? I think that's what Paul and the missionary team said when they arrived in Philippi. This ancient city was just 10 miles inland of the port. Luke tells us here that they landed in Neapolis. That's the port city in modern-day Turkey. And some 8 to 10 miles you could trek to Philippi. This past summer, I had the opportunity to make that trek. We did it in air conditioning in a car with water, and it was wonderful. But I can assure you that when Paul did this, there was so much effort involved. But here's what's significant about Philippi. Philippi is a Roman colony. It was established because of its significance and some Roman battles and their history. It's not really important. But here's what is significant. This city was given special rights and special advantages in Europe as a colony of Rome. Because of that, oftentimes military veterans who served in the army would retire into this city. So much so that Philippi was known in the ancient world as Little Rome. For Paul and his missionary team, as they stepped into Philippi, they stepped into a new culture altogether. This was truly the most culture shock they had experienced. You see, engaging in this culture meant treason to the emperor. You see, the Romans viewed their emperor as a god. And to worship anyone but him was treason and led to death. Surely what God had called them to would bring repercussions, and we'll see that in this very chapter. Perhaps that's why Luke records at the end of verse 12 that they remained in the city some days. Like, were Paul and Silas getting a lay for the land? Were they trying to figure things out? I don't know, but we do know this. After a few days, they realized God has given us confidence. And we have a mission to do. And so how do they respond? They respond by going to share the gospel. The last thing they were told to do. Hey, have you ever found in your life that you're in a situation and you just feel like you don't know what to do next? And can I just give you a little bit of wisdom from some older people in my life who've spoken to me? When you find yourself in a situation like Paul and his team are in, and they're confused and they don't really know what to do. Like, their practice was to go find Jewish people. And we learn in the passage, there is no synagogue. The Jewish people were so small. And they're kind of left going like, God, why did you bring us here? When you find yourself in those situations, here's what I want you to do. Do the last thing God told you to do. Until he gives you new direction. Obey his commands. Obey what you know. Don't make things harder. Do exactly what he's called you to. So they follow that practice and they start looking for Jewish people. In fact, Luke tells us in verse 13, look at this. He says, on the Sabbath day, because there's no synagogue, which tells us, by the way, history tells us that to have a synagogue, you had to have 10 household men, leading household men. So 10 family heads to start a synagogue. And because they don't have a synagogue, they're meeting outside the city. There was such a small population of Jews. In fact, we see that there's only women there. And perhaps there wasn't any Jewish men there, but history tells us that when there wasn't a synagogue, the Jews would go outside the city gates in an open air context, normally beside a body of water. I don't know, maybe they liked fishing after they finished. I don't know why, but they beside a body of water. So the missionary team, what do? They start looking by this riverside. They find a place of prayer with a group of women gathered together praying to Yahweh. Let me just before we move on, let me just remind you what this story is. I need you to hear the reality of what this story is. Take the details out. Hear this. We have a missionary team seeking to go to Asia Minor, but God prevents them. Instead, they receive a vision of a man in Macedonia waving, saying, hey, we need your help. So they drop everything, run there, enter into the city, and there's confusion because there's no Jews. They learn there's no synagogue. that the Romans view their emperor as a god. And then they just wander outside the city gates by the river and come across this group of Jewish women or women who are worshiping Yahweh. Like, see God's hand orchestrating every event here. Even in the confusion, God was working. This is not by coincidence that they found this group of women. And God shows up. He does exactly what he said he would do. He proves himself to be faithful. God was once again providing this team with a breadcrumb of confidence to keep trusting him, to keep going forward. And I'm convinced that God's doing the same thing in our lives. In fact, I'm convinced that what God does is he gives us these breadcrumbs of confidence so that we'll trust him, and it leads us right into a difficult season. See, Paul and this missionary team were getting ready to go through being beaten publicly and thrown in prison. They needed the assurance that God was faithful and they could trust him. My question is, will you open your eyes to see that God's hand is at work even in the confusion? That God's got your life? And can I just encourage you, if you feel like your life is falling apart, you don't see where it's going, you don't know how you're going to get the degree, how you're going to get the career, how you're going to get the girl or the guy and have the nice family and the 4-bedroom house with the white picket. Like, if you just don't know how it's going to work out, can I just encourage you, God's got it. You see, our God is like a master painter. You ever watched a painter paint? When they start, it's confusing. I mean, there's paint everywhere. They start in one corner and they go to another. I mean, if they're one of those crazy painters, you know what I'm talking about? Like the really good ones that are a little, you don't see all the details coming to life. But then at the end of the painting, when it's all said and done and they step away and they drop the brush and it's miraculous. It's beautiful. It's breathtaking. Can I just encourage you that that's what God's doing with your life? You see, you're so focused on the current details that you're not seeing the whole painting. And in fact, your life is the canvas. You're not the painter. And he's the one who's in control. He's the one who's got it. In fact, you can trust him so much because he's always existed. And he wrote your story in eternity past. And he wrote your story from end to beginning. He knows it. You can trust him. Trust him in the circumstances. Trust him in the confusion. And then finally, I want you to see this with me in these last 2 verses. See that God's hand was at work in the conversation. This conversation of evangelism, notice this. Look what Luke says in verse 14. He says, one of the women who's in this group that's praying, her name is Lydia. We learn that she's from the city of Thyatira. This city's known for selling purple goods. They had a plant that would produce a dye that would make purple things. It was an expensive commodity and one often associated with royalty. Because of this, Lydia most likely was a wealthy woman. She found herself in Philippi to trade. She probably traveled back and forth selling her goods. And in fact, many commentators have even suggested that she owned 2 homes, one in Thyatira and one in Philippi, where she would travel back and forth. I mean, this woman's legit. And here's the beautiful thing. Despite being wealthy and selling goods to royalty, Lydia herself, she wasn't truly rich, nor was she royalty herself. But upon meeting Paul and hearing of the gospel, she would become a daughter of the king and become royalty. She would know Jesus, in which there are immeasurable riches. Physically, it looked like she had a lot, but spiritually she had nothing. But all of this would change. Now notice this also, Luke says that she was a worshiper of God. This phrase is specific. It means that she's not Jewish, she's a Gentile, but she had heard of Yahweh. She had heard of the God of the Jews and been convinced of him and wanted to worship him. Most likely in Thyatira, there was a synagogue and she had heard them worshiping. She had seen them praying. She had listened to the prophecies. She'd been convinced that this God was the true God. And then look what Luke says at the end of verse 14 about her. This is a theological statement that Luke makes. He says, the Lord opened her heart to pay attention. You see, as Paul was speaking, Lydia's heart began to open. And Paul uses similar language in Ephesians 1. He says this, he's praying over this church in Ephesus, and he says that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you the spirit of wisdom and of revelation in the knowledge of him. Now listen to this, having the eyes of your heart enlightened. Paul's prayer was that the church in Ephesus would understand all that God has for them, that their heart would be filled. What God does here to Lydia's heart, it's a fulfillment of Ezekiel 36 when God said this, I'll give you a new heart and a new spirit I'll put within you. I'll remove the heart of stone from your flesh and I'll give you a heart of flesh and I'll put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. You say, Tanner, how do you know that it was God who opened her heart? Well, for one, the text says so. I mean, just that clear. Luke says it was the Lord who did it. But also, do you remember what Jesus said in John chapter 6? Listen to Jesus' words. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. Now, this was a theological thing that God had to open her heart to see the gospel. It wasn't just a normal conversation. It was carried along by the Spirit of God. As God opened her heart, he enabled Paul with power to boldly proclaim the gospel. And whenever Lydia had a question, like I think this happened in this conversation. When Lydia, she would get confused maybe, and she would start to ask a question. And before she could even get the question out, the Spirit was speaking through Paul and answering that question. And she had great clarity over the gospel. You say, Tanner, how do you know this? Because I've seen it happen time and time again when I share the gospel with people. God takes over. The Lord takes over. And I start quoting scripture that I didn't know that I've ever even read in my life. And the person's eyes are enlightened and they see Jesus. You want to know the greatest part about this story? God opened her heart and the enemy couldn't do anything to stop it. See that? He couldn't stop it. I love this. Like, here's the truth. The enemy wants to work hard against evangelism, against us sharing the gospel with lost people. But here's the beautiful truth. Greater is he that is in me than he who is in the world. Jesus is greater. His power is greater. Satan couldn't stop it. And in verse 15, we learn of Lydia's salvation. Look what Luke says in verse 15. He says, and after she was baptized. Now, in the book of Acts, baptism is used synonymously with salvation. Now, this feels a little different for us today, right? Like, we like to stand behind, hear me out on this. We like to stand behind our Christian liberty and say, I don't need to be baptized to be saved. Don't have to. And when someone says, well, how do you know that? What's your biblical evidence? We go, the thief on the cross, he wasn't baptized. Hey, listen, 100% true. But do we really want to act like the thief on the cross? Like, is he really our model? Like the guy who barely slipped in, who barely made it? Hey, hear me on this. Baptism is not required for salvation. But I will say this, obedience walks straight through baptism. And genuine salvation always walks in obedience. The genuine salvation will obey Christ because he is king. So hear me tonight. If you're running from baptism, if you believe in Jesus and you've never publicly professed him and announced that you're unashamed to follow him and you believe in his death, burial, and resurrection, if you're running from that, let's stop running. Let's walk in obedience. Because if you're running from declaring Jesus as your king, I have to question if you really trust him. If you can't stand before someone and go underneath some water, do you really know him? Do you really trust him? Lydia didn't run from it, and apparently neither did her household, because look what Luke says. It says, after she was baptized, and her household as well. Literally, the word means that all of her servants and everyone who lived inside of her house. Remember, she's a wealthy woman. I don't know how many servants she had, but I know she had some servants, plural. Her household was a whole group of people who got baptized. I don't know how they knew to trust in Jesus, But I wonder, I speculate, perhaps Lydia walked through her house thinking of the prophecies that she had heard read in the synagogue at Thyatira. I wonder if she walked through her house thinking of the book of Isaiah and all the prophecies in there about how God would bring the nations to himself and he would bring salvation to them. I wonder if Lydia walked through her house and told her servants, there's coming a day when God's going to save us all, even though we're not Jewish. I wonder if she walked into her house with that missionary team and looked at her servants and said, today is the day of salvation. How amazing is this story? God's hand was at work in the conversation. He led Paul to speak life and truth, which led to a harvest of soul. There was a breadcrumb of confidence that God's gospel was powerful. Confidence to keep proclaiming, confidence that God saw them, confidence that God did lead them to Philippi, confidence to obey. And see this, not only did God give them a harvest, he also gave them an invitation. Lydia invites them into the home. Look what she says at the end of verse 15. If you've judged me to be faithful to the Lord. She says, hey, listen, if I'm legit, if you really think that I love Jesus, like if I've proven that I love Jesus, hey, come stay with me. And she offers her home. She gives them hospitality. She welcomes the team in. What began as a strange journey to a difficult city that was confusing with promised trouble ended in a celebration of salvation and a good meal to eat with a warm bed. God's good. Breadcrumbs of confidence. One woman's heart was open to the gospel, and quite literally all of Europe and Rome would be forever changed. It was an obscure event. There was no trumpet sound. No newspaper ran a headline that read victory in bold letters. It was unknown. No world leader began to tremble at the thought of what had just happened. But given time, this news would spread and change the entire world. It reminds me to another event that occurs in the Bible just a few years back to Lydia. It's the story of a birth of a child in a stable in an obscure town called Bethlehem, to a couple that wasn't even married yet and who had never known each other. Sounds like some strange circumstances and some confusing stuff going on. But God's hand was at work. That night when the Savior, Jesus, was born in Bethlehem, no newspaper recognized it. No one declared that the King of Kings was here. The shepherds heard, of all people. Nor did the event of his death 30-something years later cause significant uproar. His death actually seemed to be the end of a great movement. But if there's one thing we can learn, it's that time reveals the significance of an event, because 3 days later, that death made a whole lot more sense. Because on the third day, Jesus rose from the dead. A sorrowful day became a day that was joyful. And in his resurrection, humanity was offered reconciliation and restoration to God. In his resurrection, the sting of death was taken and the pain of sin was removed. In Jesus' resurrection, all of history was changed. And in Acts 16, Lydia tasted of the sweetness of this news. Do you know what I'm talking about? The sweetness of forgiveness. The sweetness of knowing that you've been placed in the family of God. And for her, confidence was placed in her heart, and she trusted the Lord with all things. But what about you tonight? When you look back on your life, do you see God's hand at work? And if you do, if you see the breadcrumbs of confidence, my challenge to you is, are you trusting him? You trust him to lead you, to orchestrate your circumstances, to give you favorable sailing. It won't always be easy. The end of this chapter shows us that. But will you trust him? Trust that his way is better, that he's the master painter, and his picture looks a lot better than yours. My prayer is you would. Not only would you trust him, that you'd be filled with worship and gratitude for all that he's done for us. We have a lot to be thankful for.